Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar. We continue to feature the works of authors we know and love through readings, discussions, and forums, moving into the summer season and beyond. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We'd like to take this moment to acknowledge those who have come before us as stewards of the land and give an offering of respect. Today on City Lights Live, we are delighted to have with us Booker Prize winning novelist James Kelman, celebrating the publication of his new novel, God's Teeth and Other Phenomena, published by our friends at PM Press. Mr. Kelman's experiments with vernacular speech and his mastery of the internal dialogue has brought us some of the most compelling fiction to date. He's the author of such titles as How Late It Was, How Late, also The Disaffection, amongst others. Now, we are very, very fond memories of an epic event we helped co-host with Mr. Kelman, 25 years ago or something, and it dates me for certain. It was over at Fort Mason, and it showcased a bunch of Scottish writers. I think, God, Alan helped me. Was it Duncan MacLean? I think Irvine Welsh was on board. So quite a scene. It's really an honor to have Mr. Kelman back in our orbit once again. So to do the honors tonight is none other than Alan Black, who is no stranger to City Lights. He's a good friend, and we've had a great many collaborations together over the years. Alan has been a mover and shaker in the San Francisco literary scene. He asked me to spare him a brief bio, but the truth is he is too damn modest. So I have to give praise where praise is due. He's played a vital role in the literary culture of the city. So it's great to have him back with us. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to our guests. James Kelman, Alan Black, an honor and pleasure to have you with us today, back in our orbit. Welcome to the virtual City Lights.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Although I'm still in Glasgow.
So you're in Glasgow, Jim.
Yeah.
And well, we always have to ask the first question when you're in Glasgow. How's the weather?
The weather is absolutely wonderful. It's very Scottish.
Fantastic. Glad to hear that.
That's
so
why I've got a jacket on.
That's your jacket. So I think we're going to start off with a selection you're going to read from the new novel, God's Teeth and Other Phenomena. And if we kick off with that, we'll get a sense of, unless you want to give us a little setup, Jim, about the book and then a reading from it. That'd be good.
Well, the novel, it's the central character is a writer who's trying to survive as most writers and artists try to do. And often what comes out of it is that the only way to survive is by tutoring other people to do what you would prefer to be doing yourself if you could earn enough dough to do it. So that's basically the basic scenario of the novel. Just as it says in the blurbs, the writer's a guy, a man of 66, a grandfather who's been around he's been writing like for 40 odd years. He's the recipient of a major prize many years ago, which is kind of not dissimilar to the Booker Prize. So a lot of the experiences are based on my own experiences of going around and tutoring and so one thing and another. And I was wanted to read one section or have a go at reading one section tonight. And in a sense, it gives an idea of what can go on. He's doing like a 5 year, sounded like 5 years. The guy's doing a 5-week residency or a 6-week residency. And this thing I'm going to read is his very first event. The first event takes place about the first day after he arrives. And he goes and it's in the first person, this novel. And it just begins I couldn't find the organisers. I went for a walk outside the venue. This fellow approached, an anxious fellow, covering his head with a flyer. He smiled and he waved. Hello, there you are. He was glancing at his watch in such a manner, I knew he was He was giving me a row. And from the way he did this, I could tell how he brought up his kids, how he had been brought up himself, and also his aspirations, settling for a dull mediocrity, a life of paper clips and staff meetings. His hair was standing on end and words were failing him. Here he was, drenched to the skin and having to face this old man, me, with fire erupting from my nostrils. And he was right. I was going to eat this bastard. Are you the organizer? I said, oh, not really. They asked me to officiate. I teach at the university here. Oh, okay. Unfortunately, they've got me down to read from a novel I wrote 15 years ago. I just wish they had asked first. I've written 5 other novels, not to mention a clutch of other stuff, short stories, lyrics, squibs, blogs, fancy texts, old-style reviews, old-style essays, every kind of old-style writing. I stopped and I grinned at the guy. The worry in his face was a worry to me. I put him about 40 years of age, a father, definitely, young teenagers, heart attacks were on the way. He nodded, peering someplace else, his face twisted and his eyes closed. Poor bugger, don't worry, I said. He blinked at me. I'll introduce myself. I'll read the opening section from the book and I'll do a couple of stories. You just come on at the end for the QA. It'll be fine. I shrugged and I glanced at my watch. Oh, okay, he said. Mark Allen is reading with you. Mark Allen? Mark's reading with you. Pardon? Mark Allen. Mark's a local writer. He's very highly regarded. Do no one say? Mark's very good, very popular and funny. He has this tremendous sense of humour, never contrived. He's a brilliant raconteur. The chair was smiling in this most peculiar manner. He raised his head and he looked me right in the eye. Mark keeps people going. He'll be a strong support. He's a very popular writer, very highly regarded. I punched him on the shoulder, lightly, cheerily. You mean now there's 2 of us on the programme, me and this other writer? Mark, yes, he's very popular. Oh, so I'll need to half my performance now. Is that what you're telling me? There's only 2 minutes to go. I'll need to half my performance. He smiled uncertainly. The word performance had thrown him. Mark will happily go first, he said. Oh, is that a fact? Happily. Oh, good. I'll go for a pint then. Any pubs around here? I patted him on his shoulder. I am going a walk round the block now to clear my head. If a pub is there, I shall go to it, or not, as the case may be. One thing, but don't introduce me as Jock, or I'll find your fucking house and burn it down. Know what I mean? They mixed up my name, Jack, with Jock. Don't worry, I know it's not your fault. I left him. Not that it mattered anyway. Half the performance, fair enough. Who gives a fuck? None of it matters. How come they even bother? Okay, I would just apologise, blame the organisers. It was their fault anyway. Hell with it. I strolled round the block again. At least it wasn't raining. I quite liked the weather when it was not raining. Not a bad wee town either, more like a big village. Saw this elderly man pass along with a stupid fucking dog. He gave me one of these quizzical looks. I'm the guest writer, I shouted inwardly. Maybe I could just sing a song to the audience, coming through their eye or some such shite, thinking of that old Kentucky thing with gin a body, booze everywhere. The elderly man had stopped along the street so the dog could have a piss. He stared back at me. Maybe I was speaking out loud. As a young fellow, I chatted an algorithm based on inward ponderings, deducible from outer fidgeting. I could tell that to the audience. It made an interesting diversion for those of a psychotic bent. Then I saw the chair at the entrance to the Arts Centre. Another guy with him, Mark Allen, no doubt, author of The Uniform Dandelion in Charged Urban Settings, a story of Chandler-esque detection among the smooth-talking domestic military, 30,000 copies sold in a week, purchased en masse by the War Office for distribution among the overseas military. After he'd introduced us, the chair said, "Shall we do a Q&A?" Mark smiled benignly. "Audiences enjoy them," he murmured. "People prefer audience participation at literary events." I looked at him and gripped my fingers tightly. Uriah Heep grasping and ungrasping his at the final denunciation. Old fucking Uriah, man, rhyming with pariah, with Black Mariah, gripping one's fingers in case off they flew away. Mark in the chair gestured me ahead. On stage, a table and 3 chairs. There was a wee desktop mic thing in the middle. A young guy with a beard the length of Methuselah was fiddling away with this wee desktop mic, watched by the chair proudly. "Jonathan's on sound," he said. And to Jonathan, "Things okay, Jonathan?" Jonathan ignored the silly bastard and continued tickling the mic and pushing it about the table. His beard informed the world of his technical prowess. I wish there was a pair of scissors in my pocket. The chair was pointing at 3 chairs, and he said to Jonathan, "Shall I sit in the middle?" Jonathan pondered. "What's happening?" I said to the chair. "Are we supposed to do the reading from here? Sitting down at the table, chins on our knees, talking into that stupid wee mic?" Jonathan frowned up at me. "Is there a problem? I need a stand. I need an upright stand." "We have a clip on. I use an upright stand. That is what I need." "I'm not certain there is one. What is it for exactly?" I smiled at the bearded bastard and he held my gaze. He looked to Mark and eventually to the chair who studied the floor. "I don't sit during the performance. I stand. I stand at a mic, and the mic is attached to that upright thing, the upright stand. That's what I need." Jonathan stared at me. "It's like a singer. You know the way a singer stands at the effing mic?" "Nobody told me," he said. "Oh, is that a fact? I'll look, but I don't think there is one." Fine. I stepped down from the stage. Jonathan returned with the mic later. Eventually, Mark returned to the table, shuffling his papers. Mark had friends and family present and a pile of older school pupils. This was his first book. The atmosphere was very cheery, as it should have been. Somebody attracted his attention, his mother or his auntie. He gave them a wave to tremendous applause. Then he spoke about the book, and he read wee bits here and there to tremendous applause. It wasn't about angst-ridden detectives after all, thank fuck. The extracts he read were humorous anecdotes relating to childhood and made reference to several personages who were sitting right there in the first and second fucking row. This continued for 35 minutes. The audience thoroughly enjoyed his performance and were loath to let him leave, including the chair, who giggled frequently throughout. Mark saluted the audience to more applause, clamorous applause. Then he retreated to a chair down the side of the space. People cheered him along, and even when he was seated, elderly whiskered gents were reaching to tap him on the shoulders with their Malacca walking cane. "Well done, my boy." I clambered up from my chair onto the stage, and I laid my books on the table. I felt like the Sheriff of Nottingham. I muttered, missing the mic by a foot. I began the short and 2-page opening from the book, but it was sounding good, so I continued for 4. People clapped. "Thanks," I said. I glanced at my list of short stories and reached for the books, but the chair appeared beside me. He announced the closure of the first half of the event. More clap. I was still leafing through the pages of the book. "Is that me finished?" I whispered off mic. "What?" said the chair. "Mark's been on for 37 minutes. And here's me getting 10, including breath pauses." I smiled. The chair smiled too, thinking it was being friendly. And he reached as though to shake my hand. Then he had the good sense to back off, glimpsing the back density of my eyes, heralding an untimely end for the unwary and those fools disinclined to heed omens and portents of doom. A group of aunties and uncles and school pupils were by now circling Mark. Others were scraping back chairs and moving around, repairing to the bar. There they all were, everybody. I repaired to the fucking Clydgie. A whiskey would have been good, but to be avoided. I left the building thereafter. That'll do.
Fantastic. That was wonderful. It was great. Great to hear you read again, Jim, and see you do it. That was really excellent. Really fantastic. I have a few scattered notes here around. We'll try and pull them together a little bit. Just what you were saying there, to pick up a little bit on that concept of the image, you know, of the writer, and how that you know, creates that sort of energy of popularity now around the idea of the word writer itself. It's almost as if you need a stylist and a publicist, you know, to make sure that the image of yourself somehow is connected to what is on the page. You get any thoughts on how that's emerged, you know, how that's changed?
I mean, it has changed, you know, but it's also what changes is your response to it. Like when I was a young writer, I was published pretty early. My first book was published, I was 26. So, which is for a writer is quite early. It's published in the States, in fact. It was published over in the East Coast, over in Maine. Small publisher there published it. So, and on the strength of this little book of short stories, I got some work as a part-time tutor. I was driving buses at the time, but this little job, part-time, maybe once every couple of weeks, I did a 2-hour stint, you know. And the issue for me was, how do writers look? I didn't really know how writers look, you know. I knew they didn't wear a bus driver's outfit, but I didn't really know what to do. Was like, do you look like a hippie, or do you look like an academic? Or I used to kind of vary between them. Sometimes I had a beard. I had a beard, I think, at that time. Other times I'd shave off the beard, and sometimes I had a duffel coat. I used to wear the duffel coat on occasion. I once went into a very famous bookshop in Edinburgh, and they thought I was into to steal books. You know, they actually ejected me. That was James in Edinburgh. Off you go. I say, get the manager, I'm doing a reading here. Then another time I thought, man, that doesn't work. I should do something else. So in Glasgow, I was the generation we were mods, you know, like a mod, like bands like the Small Faces, and so they dress like mods, you know. That's that London musician still dresses that way. Can't remember his name. Anyway, so I thought, I'll wear my Crombie coat, you know. So I was doing this thing down in Ayrshire. Like I was taking this creative writing workshop. And usually I turned up, and they were all about 3 times the age of me. They were all about 66, like this guy, and I would be about 40 years younger or something, 35 years younger. So I said, I better wear my Crombie coat. So and I'll not take a car because it might break down, you know. So I'll get the train. So I had that, and you know, I shaved and all that. And I wore a shirt, and I didn't wear jeans. Like I wore a pair of trousers. I stand the train, you know, like the tragedy of this night was that people will have heard of Glasgow Celtic football team. Well, Celtic were playing a cup game that night in Ayrshire. I think we were playing against Ayr United. The train was full of Celtic supporters. Right? And as soon as I stepped on, somebody said, "Look at Elmer Fudd." It was me, man.
Yeah,
so
and that just blew it up.
I just don't know what to do here. So from there on, I said to my publisher, "Man, I really need a publicist. I don't know. I just write these stories. You've got to get somebody here to like take care you do the peripherals.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that makes me, I'm just asking you a few questions about that. I get your thoughts, I mean, on the process, the process of writing. In the book, Proctor, who's the main character, he says, I need to write. It's pathological. If I can, I shall. And it's taken out of a paragraph. There's a little bit missing. And you also mentioned, I think even in the past, speaking to you, is that you batter on with it.
Yeah.
And of course, there are other quotes that I came across, recently. There's one from Kafka here. I'll just drop that in. From a certain point, there is no more turning back. That's the point that must be reached. Now, when you, as a writer, when you batter on with that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, what that means.
There's two good points you make there, or rather, 2 points can be separated from the one that you've given me. One is the idea of battering on in the sense that the way that Kafka might mean it, which is there's a point in the story where you must go with it and run with it, no matter how difficult it may be or appear, or how unconnected it may appear to what you're doing. You really need to go with it. That for me is that's separate from the other point. Another way of looking at battered on means it's really hard to exist as an artist, any artist. And it's almost every area of society is attempting to stop it from happening. That's the way it appears when you're younger. Eventually, when you're very young, you go for it because you believe that doing your best is what's required. But once you get a little bit older and gradually you realize when you do your best, it may in fact not be what's required. For doing your best, you may receive great hostility. And what you're required by society is to not do your best. You start off trying to be like Kafka, and you end up being like Raymond Chandler, for instance. You end up taking the pressure to go where the market says you should be going. And you end up doing like yet another detective with existential angst. The world's been bursting with these sorts of characters. But for you to go back and try and do something kind of as real as you can do, that is where you find that is not what society is, or what authority wants from you. Authority is not wanting that from you. So in that sense, what you do then, you must batter on, stay with what you should be doing and don't go with that. The other side is basically to do with it's a formal thing. The idea that sometimes when you're and that the idea of battering on in art applies across the board to all art. Very much so in music. You find in music, there's really good examples. I kind of like examples that to do with Miles Davis. You read Miles Davis's autobiography, and what you get from that, there's so many great insights into how art is made. There was a really good point made about battering on from the point, and it was said by Herbie Hancock, the great musician, played when he was 19 playing with Miles Davis, and he said it was so good for him playing and keeping up. And then when he was early on, he made a fault, a discordant key. He hit something that was so wrong, but Miles Davis never said anything and didn't stop, and the band continued. And a way further on, whatever it was that Miles Davis had done, he carried forward that kind of discordant or out of tune note, and eventually, gradually, he had made it consistent, and it was coherent, and that became almost like a different piece of music, but staying with it and just staying with really where that kind of a moment of like the tightest improvisation might take you. That's also what happens to me, that happens in all great art. And that's what you're aiming for. That little thing, keep with it, run with it, see where it takes you.
Yes, I think this is a quote from the book on this topic here. He says, what we do is shift things about not inside, but outside in the material world. Cut, copy, and paste.
Yeah.
What does Proctor mean when he's...
See, I think it's very important. This is what Proctor says, and I would say that it's always very important to work by analogy with other art forms. Now, just say, for example, in the visual arts, the way, if that the very idea of a visual artist working, somehow trying to transcribe what was inside his or her brain onto the canvas, it's actually so stupid that you don't kind of, unless you're talking about the most basic representational art or something. Oh, today I'll paint a dog, or something like, something kind of like that. But if you're an artist that you're beginning in freedom, you're beginning in you don't know what the hell you're going to do. Basically you're sitting down to do your work, which is creating art and working on your art. So none of that goes on up here. What you're essentially doing is doodling. It's like there's another point where Jack Proctor talks about that. The way a painter doodles with drawing or painting a brush, the way a musician sits down on the piano, has a guitar, whatever the instrument is, and starts to tinker, footer around, and gradually will go somewhere where the music takes them. It's not beginning up here. It's beginning with the actual thing itself. Mm. So that's what I'm saying is what writers do. Mm. This is what this writer does. This is why I have so many stories and stuff that's like beginnings, middles, no endings, and just kind of battering on. Does that make sense? Right.
Yeah, it does. I remember you one time saying to me, I think, if I'm right, my memory's working, that, you may have written a story, 30 years ago, but you still are working on it. You'll rework it. It still hasn't been completed. A little bit about the practice here. There's another quote in the book that Proctor says is about the practice. He said, "Should we be surprised that experienced writers might know more about the practicalities than inexperienced writers? People need to arrive at a position where it is possible to say what good writing might be or bad writing."
Yeah.
So does this come about just through the battering on the practice of it?
Yeah. It's also to do with developing what it is you do. It's like, talking earlier, we were talking about San Francisco and the way I think Peter maybe begun about 1997 and all that when we were in San Francisco. But one of the great things at that point for myself was meeting someone whose work I'd known for like 20 years, which is Tilly Olsen. So Tilly came to a reading and I'd communicated or corresponded with her for a short period. I didn't know she was coming to the reading, and by that time she was very old. But when you think of a writer like Tilly Olsen, and so much of her time was spent kind of rearing families and so on, but she was always developing. She's got maybe 4 or 5 stories that have changed how short stories are written. She's just such a beautiful damn writer. One of the many great kind of American female writers that Gertrude Steen's later work, which I found so exciting as a young writer. But it's that way you develop what it is you're doing. When you develop what you're doing, it leads you to understand what other writers are also doing. Mm. It becomes the clearest thing for me as a writer to know when another writer is describing and not giving us the thing itself. If a writer is using adjectives and being what you might describe as, you go, oh, come on, don't be lazy, man. Find the right verb. Just, don't have these stupid, adjectives and so on. Like, classic English literature, it's shit. You've got to go to the existential moment. We want to know what it is to exist. You know, I mean, this is not like 300 years ago when you could have like somebody, you know, somebody walks on the stage with us saying, 5 years passed. The central character was angry for that entire 5 years. You can't do that any longer. You've got to give us like 19th century prose fiction changed. It changed things. From that period, you got people like Kafka, Chekhov, Tolstoy. You got all those great writers that were coming into kicking off the 20th century. You have to take that stuff. It's not difficult to spot the difference between Agatha Christie and Samuel Beckett. To talk about the value of their work, any writer who says you cannot distinguish between them is telling lies. They're just telling you lies. And the same applies to writers of genre fiction when they continue to insist that they should be evaluated in the same way that, you know, that Kafka is being evaluated. That kind of thing is just silly.
Yeah.
It's been allowed to stay because the values of the marketplace take over the aesthetic. I mean, that's pretty clear.
Yeah. I was hosting a class with incarcerated people in the prison system here a few years ago, writing class, and we were talking about editing, and the response was that editing, or the editor, was some form of thief who was taking what you had created and had somehow stolen it and turned it into a version that they themselves imagined it should be. I thought that was an interesting, I'd never heard the editor being accused of, you know, being a thief. Now, you mentioned editing and the process of editing and writing. Can you talk a little bit about that, how you relate to the self-editing process, and then how you communicate with an editor who is, you know, dealing with the line edits in the book?
It's very difficult, really. It's difficult for a writer like myself, or any writer who works in a non-standard form. That's very difficult. If you see where, you know, people will understand the distinction between English language literature and English literature. So English language literature changes things like syntax and rhythms. So we bring in literature from the former English Empire, you know, African literature, literature from Indian subcontinent, literature, stories written obviously by poor white, African Americans, Scottish working class, Irish working class, anyone who's trying to get to stay beyond the behavior of a character, to take all the disenfranchised areas of humanity and give them the freedom to be a writer, to develop their work as a writer. They need to have the language, they need to be allowed the freedom to use language as language is used by the people who use it. That's what the hell language is. It's the means to communication between one another. So when you know, there are so many examples of this, but it's very hard for people to actually grasp. Those who like myself change their language all the time to suit. What happens if you get like an African-American working class guy from San Francisco talking to a white working class Glaswegian? I mean, down in Tenderloin or someplace like that. What if somebody wants to write a story about these two characters meeting on the street? How is it possible to do that without the language that each individual uses? It's impossible. So what you get is like huge areas of working class experience, non-kind of bourgeois, I use that term, non-standard. They have no existence in literature. Now, almost every single editor you can think of has come through the classic standard English literary form education. Almost every editor I have ever had tries to impose standard form on me. As soon as I do something like, this character's an atheist, when he says God love us, it's with a lowercase g, every editor faints. You think they're going to get fucking killed by somebody. You go, look, how can you have an atheist? Can I be an atheist in English literature? You know what I mean? You know, but there's all these different examples you can give, but the poor old editor has to kind of try to grasp that this can be valid.
Yeah.
And once you get the editor on your side by taking the pains to explain what the hell goes on in literature or what can go on, it's important the writer cannot just be like the naughty adolescent and say, oh, I'm a great artist. You know, you've got to go and help people out.
Yeah.
You've got to say, look, this is what's going on here.
Yeah.
You've got to try and maybe and come to terms. You've got to read other people. You've got to like understand what Sarah Wheeler was doing in his Saucer Boy novel. You have to understand what these writers are doing. You know, it's really important the editors have to know that. Until then, the guys who are trying to write while they're locked up are quite right. So I go along with them to that extent, you know.
Yeah, it's going on from that. There's a little quote about readability. Proctor talks about, there's a little thing on readability. He says, no, I said, can I talk about readability? Let me ask you all a question. How come persons seek to write books who have no interest in books? Again, I thought that was an interesting. Anyway, there's a couple of things in that struck me. I wanted just to maybe get your thoughts on. There's a great scene when Proctor goes to the bar and the bartender is a grumpy bastard.
Yeah.
And this idea of the grumpy bastard, you know, myself being a bartender, it's always an accusation that one has to deal with when it's thrown at you like an olive thrown from an olive pick in a failed martini. I see that he took the chance to sit on a stool at the bar to annoy him. And there's that relationship between the grumpy bastard and the need to annoy the grumpy bastard.
You've got to understand, it depends on the licensing laws. You know, like a grandfather of mine used to make people laugh by saying, you know, the thing I love about the licensed trade, the bar industry, they always kick out their best customers. You know, the guys that get drunk get ejected. But of course, he was thinking about Glasgow. In Glasgow, you've got to drink up, you know, what time is it? Come on, to 11, man, we get kicked out to 11. 6 pints, that's for me. Whereas it's not like the pubs you're on, Alan.
Yeah, that's
good old legendary Edinburgh Castle.
That's kind of funny.
3 o'clock in the morning, you're still like...
yeah, you're still rolling around. Another thing, in the setting in the book, there's a canal.
Yeah,
and Proctor, you know, he walks down the canal, he thinks of the canal. He thinks about falling into it. It's not like being drowned in a river, he says, but you're fucking poisoned in a canal. Yeah. And I wondered, you know, the choice of the canal as opposed to the choice of a river, which has much more of a, you know, flow. The idea of the canal was interesting. Can we talk a little bit about, you know, maybe why you chose the canal, or what was the influence on that?
Well, there are different influences on it. You know, some of the factories I've worked in were beside canals, you know, and the people just used to, everything was just pitched into the canal, you know, so detergent and so on. And that was a joke. If you fell in a canal, you died of diphtheria, you didn't drown, you know. So there's that. But in some parts of Scotland, I mean, our part, where I live right here in North Glasgow, there's a canal about like a mile away, and some of it's been reclaimed. It's good good areas, still not safe. Like for a single woman is very cautious about walking canals, right? I mean, that's the way it is here, not just here, but in most places. It's a cautionary thing.
Yeah.
At the same time, they're trying to reclaim, people are trying to reclaim canals here. You know, the canal here, it's kind of important. You don't get rivers everywhere.
Right.
It's not, well, it's a big deal in some ways. There's also the sense it's so absurd, the guy that is in this holiday home next to a canal.
Right.
But at the same time, that's the kind of thing that happens with organisers. You know, you go to a place and it ends up and there's no organisation at all.
Right.
So, I mean, again, the novel's to do with that sense in which it's total exploitation. Anyway.
And one last thing, I think then we can, have some questions from those who have joined us today. There's a really brilliant little chapter in it, if I'm remembering this correctly, called The Pattern, where there are kids who are crossing a burn, as we call it.
Yeah.
A creek maybe here would be a rough translation. And they have no time to figure out the pattern of the stones to get across to the other side.
Yeah.
You know, they just enter into it and find a way across. And then the authorities, the art police, the teachers, they are coming after them, but they have to figure out the pattern, the way across. I thought that was a lovely way to express that kind of, perhaps that freedom you were talking about as an artist, to create something, if you like, to batter on without having to see what lies ahead.
Without having to consult a diagram about how to move.
Right.
You move.
Right.
You know, I mean, when you think about it, you know, not only does it happen in art, but it happens in all sport. You think about the way someone connects with a ball, whether it's football, soccer, whether it's tennis or whatever it is, you have that tremendous coordination. It's to do with that, the way young kids will scramble over boulders. You watch them crossing a burn, a stream, and they'll cross over, they won't stop unless maybe a stone's covered in water and it slips.
Yeah.
It's, you know, slipping, kid might slide. Otherwise, they'll run across.
Yeah.
Now, that's a really crucial thing, but it would also take you into like learning theory. In a sense, that would be that type of coordination. That would be also where I think Noam Chomsky's that idea of learning theory would take you there. How do we know? I mean, I could imagine Socrates giving that example about how we cross a stream, you know, that it's done in that way. He may go for prior knowledge or something, but the difference between that and maybe someone like Chomsky would be, well, yeah, but there is some kind of inbuilt faculty, but there's that kind of idea of the coordination of space and so on. That is part of that's part of what humanity is. This is species specific. Like the potential for language, the potential for movement, the potential for connecting in that way, the potential for being able to like do the most basic things you can think of, you know, like how can you judge, you know, when you cross a road and there's a car coming, how do you know when to cross the road?
Right.
You've already taken in velocity, sound.
Yeah.
You're using 5 senses. And that sense is like, you know, I would try and get across to students, community, people involved in art about how important it is to be aware that you have 5 senses, and you have the 6th thing you have is the coordinate the 5. You can coordinate. How does a blind person get to do certain things? These issues I had to kind of deal with in how late it was, how late that novel was. You had to try and work out or be aware. When does a blind person react to stimuli or a stimulus? Like, you know, when does a person jump? At what point? When does a writer go? So that became very important. Jump. Oh, it was a bus. You know, firstly, there's the sensory experience, which is, and then it is the reaction. Oh, and then the corollary is that was a bus.
Right.
Most kind of writers who have never worked out about what goes on in literature, that's what they maybe do, things like put a description first.
Yeah.
Or when they use classically, if they use maybe in English language, you would go the adverbial clause, they put the when first. When he got there, there's something happened. You never see that in Kafka. That's not a possibility in Kafka. Every single point along the road is the potential for drama.
Right.
The character got up off the chair. The character walked to the door. The character opened the door. The door opened. Whack! Somebody punched him.
Right.
Every single movement is drama. But most writers who begin writing, most people who begin writing, destroy drama in the first sentence. It's destroyed, you know. And again, it's part of the reason why the older or the experienced writer, you know, can talk to people who are not so experienced, but who are also writing, because they're liable to go, oh, I know exactly what you mean. I know what you mean, man, I get it.
All right, that's great. Thanks for reading, Jim. The book, God's Teeth and Other Phenomena, you can get it at City Lights, and it's for those of us who have the Kelman canon on the shelf. This is an important one, so make sure you get it. So Peter, if you're there somewhere in the
oh yeah,
there you are.
Thank you so much for that. Wow. So yeah, we got a bunch of questions. I don't know if we'll have time to get through all of them, but I can begin just going backwards. I don't know. We've got let's see. Lee says, what a treat to hear you read. You are undoubtedly one of our greatest writers, and your internationalism and support for the Kurds has been an education in itself for me. To my mind, you are just too big for the British literary establishment to handle. Do you think Samuel Beckett had the right idea running off to France, where they actually value writers and intellect?
To some extent, you might say Beckett had no choice, because he saw what had happened to James Joyce. And I mean, part of the reason why Beckett went also was he was very keen on Descartes, too, René Descartes, the philosopher, and he wanted to kind of do some work on Descartes as far as I recall. But at that time, the censorship in Ireland was really prohibitive to anything. You know, I mean, it was shocking what was going on in Ireland, you know, in various ways. So Beckett got away from that point of view, and I thought what age he was, in his early 20s or something. So I think he definitely had the right idea. You have to get away from that type of culture. You have to get some exist to some in freedom. I mean, the Irish culture, Irish society at that time, it was shocking. You know, to have come out of such a great political experiences, you know, that resulted in 1916, to go from there to being having been overrun by the authority, whether it came from church or state, it was shocking after these people had been executed by the British state. Shocking. So, you know, I mean, it's difficult. Talking about Beckett's always difficult in a sense, because he comes from a different culture than James Joyce. James Joyce came from, you might say, the Celtic side of Ireland, whereas Beckett came from it was the Anglo-Irish tradition that Beckett came from. So it meant, for example, that I would say, this is my own, that Beckett's grasp of the rhythmic side of what Joyce was doing, maybe in his later work, Beckett was not, didn't have to explore that. This is the way I'm looking at it. But where Beckett becomes really exciting for writers is his fight with space and time. Beckett is really, I don't think he quite got it. That's a personal, but it's that tremendous fight he did which is a very formal fight in a sense. It's very, I mean, it's kind of no different to what the great some of the great modernist writers were doing. I think Beckett's on at that level. Anyway, I've got to that from the questions.
Okay. So Megan says, last time I heard you speak, you spoke very passionately about African writing and the writing of the Indian subcontinent. And earlier tonight, you mentioned Kensero Wiwas. Is it okay if I can ask you a bit more of your thoughts on these writings?
No, not at all. I mean, it's such a big area. Okay, I've written one. I've written many. I've written quite a bit on it. I've written an essay on the great Nigerian writer Amos Chuchuola, in which I speak about Sarawiwa too. But the crucial factor there is no different from the crucial factor as it affects myself, or as it affects some of the great Caribbean writers who were after the same thing. Some Scottish and Irish, but Scottish writers were not always after this, but it's very similar to what was going on from the diaspora writers from Africa and India, which is how do we exercise our freedom as writers in a language that's been thrust upon us by the imperialist? That's the essential factor. How do we suffer this imperialism where our languages are prescribed, where our traditions and cultures are being erased, where even to use the language we shall be punished? Mm-hmm. The last person mentioned Kurdistan. Kurdistan offers a great example of that, what happened to not only Kurdish writers, but to the Kurdish population who were not able to use their own language at all. They could not name their children Kurdish names. Now that happened in my own culture, Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic culture. My grandmother's from Lewis and the Outer Hebrides. She was a Gaelic speaker. None of her sons learned Gaelic, never mind her grandchildren. The language was prescribed. The culture was prescribed. There is no difference between what happened there and what happened in terms of the very many different languages in India and Africa and other parts of the former English Empire. There is no difference there. So when you're working in the English language tradition that I mentioned, I referred to earlier, what you're doing is trying to chat the rhythms, the syntax, and the phrasing from your own indigenous culture. And you're trying to trap it as best you can within this language that's been forced on you, standard English literary form. So you're trying to squeeze it every way you can. You're trying to, this is why so many of the, well, you might say early stories of mine, not only early, were always written in the past participle. I was walking. Using that sense was what, so the verb I was seeing, that kind of, or even you could use the present tense. You take an American writer, Damon Runyon. It always looked very difficult if you're going to have to speak, just say you're an actor and they gave you a story by Damon Runyon. Big Nig is walking down the road. The Lemon Drop Kid is walking to it, something like that. But see if you explain to the actor, look, just use an apostrophe. So Big Nick's walking down the road and imagine you're standing in a bar. That's exactly what the storyteller tells. Damon Runyon, in that sense, is just formalized the storyteller. It's not as sophisticated as someone like Chuchuola or others, but that's what he's doing. So what you're actually getting, you're actually getting this idea of what it is to speak in that other type of language. This is what's, every time you go up against the establishment, you're up against imperialist in terms of language. Standard English literary form to that extent it's the voice of the imperialist and it's the imposition of the imperialist. That's what it is.
There's a great deal of love coming through the chat. David says, Fuck Your Readability, quote unquote, was quoted admiringly by Emir McBride during your keynote address at the Centenary Joyce Symposium in Dublin on June 16th. Damn right. And then, yeah, I think we can have time maybe for one more. Mia asks, I know you have done stints in academia, quote, a life of paper clips and dull meetings, unquote, as a guest writer. What have you learned about the life of old style writing, quote unquote, and its value in contemporary creative writing programs?
Old style writing?
That's what the quote is, yeah. Perhaps pre-20th century is maybe what they mean.
Well, in terms of what I've been saying, I could go, well, one of the immediate figures, I'm trying to find people who are not Scottish, because that was part of the Scottish tradition, was to use language as it was used by ordinary people, by ordinary language users. So that's like an 18th century tradition. So you'll get, for example, Ferguson and Burns and James Hogg, who wrote the great Confessions of a Justified Sinner. You will get that tremendous use of language. He wrote that about 1830 or something like that. But in the English tradition, you'll get Emily Bronte. Emily Bronte is really great in Wuthering Heights. I'm pretty sure it's Wuthering Heights. That's Charlotte that wrote that. Did Emily Bronte? No, she wrote Emily Bronte. That is just the sense of a human being's voice. I think it's no accident that you maybe one can refer to a woman as far as that goes, because what you will find is like the female voice is trying to come clear of male authority. And when you're getting these great, see when you see people like, there's another great American writer, I really enjoyed her work, Meridel Lesueur. She's not, I don't think it's long since she died. So you get somebody like Meridel Lesueur, you get Gertrude Stein, you get Tilly Olsen, you get, it's such a great tradition of women fighting against male authority. And what they have to do is try and cleanse standard form of male value. You get that also among some gay writers. You get that, for example, from Jean Genet and some of his stuff. You get this tremendous thing that makes you look at things that you'd never looked at before. How the hell can be a murder described as beautiful? You know, you read The Miracle of Rose and you go, that's Jean Genet. You know, no wonder Sartre went to and thought, Christ, this is just marvelous what he's doing. But you will get that attention to that. That's actually what did Gertrude Stein say in Sherwood Anderson? What did she see in his work? She loved his work and loved the man. Well, you see Sherwood Anderson, you think, for fuck's sake, man, he's so far superb compared to Ernest Hemingway. Why does the establishment always talk about Hemingway? Why don't they talk about fucking Carlos Williams? Carlos Williams comes from Sherwood Anderson. Look at Carlos Williams's essay in Sherwood Anderson and Gertrude Stein. Man, I could go on here.
Please do.
It's like Hemingway looks good in a beard.
Well, he does the right thing, comes from, and he's involved in the same shit, which is basically male value. Let me go and drink whiskey. I don't take water in my whiskey. What? Fuck off, man. Give us a break. Give us your gun. I'll fucking shoot the tiger.
Fabulous.
Has been such a delight, and we are ever grateful and honored, Mr. Kelman, to have you, albeit virtually. You know, one of the things I
would skin it and make a nice curry out of it, man. That's a difference.
And Alan, you are the consummate pro at these things. Thanks for doing the honors.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for having me, and good to see you.
And only regret is we can't all go out for drinks afterwards.
That's okay. We'll do it some other point. It's great to see you, Jim.
And thanks to my grandson for helping me out with the techniques.
Brilliant.
Well, we're grateful to them. And everybody, you know, City Lights is still open for business. So come on down. Though we can't host events inside the store, you can still browse, check out our stacks. Also want to remind you that today's event has been made possible by the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, a publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. Be safe, be well. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks, everyone.